All right, hey folks, more muscle with drop sets. That's the topic of the day. This is now the second credible study that I've seen over the last 5 years, which looks at drop sets and shows a significant increase in muscle over regular traditional training. So I want to just share this study with you today, talk through it. I've written down some bullet points, and then I want to have a discussion at the end and hear your guys' thoughts on what do you think is the mechanism behind why we're getting better results with drop sets, because it's quite significant. So let's start with, firstly, the method. Now, in terms of this study, this was released, yeah, and I heard about it just recently on Schoenfeld's Facebook, Brad Schoenfeld's Facebook. It's him in the study, and the study is called, there we go, drop set training elicits differential increases in non-uniform hypertrophy of the quadriceps in leg extension exercise. That is from Schoenfeld, Vuk, Janga, and Varovic in 2021 in Croatia. So I've linked it in the description, so go ahead and check it out and read it for yourself. Now, in terms of the method, this is what they did. They took a bunch of people, I think it was like 24 people in the end. They started with more, but a few people had to drop out. So they had 24 people in the end, guys. They were kinesiology students who had been training for at least a year. So relatively well trained, plus they were kinesiology students, so it meant that they had an interest in training. So one would assume that they were at least halfway trained. So they weren't untrained beginners. And yes, 1 year is not long enough, but I think it's sufficient to make a point, plus alongside the other studies that we've got on it. But anyway, the method. So they randomly assigned one leg to either protocol. So these guys, they were being trained on both protocols. And I find that really interesting because, as you can sort of guess, if it's two different groups, with one group doing just drop set work and the other group doing just traditional training, there might be individual variances, but we don't get the individual variances because we do that very clever thing of having either leg trained with both approaches. So that's kind of cool. So each leg was randomly assigned to either the drop set protocol or the traditional training protocol, which was like multiple sets. Now, they were just using the leg extension on that for this study. And I believe they were instructed not to use any other leg training, just do this leg extension exercise for the next 12 weeks. So what was measured was the rec fem and the vastus lateralis. Now the rec fem, for those who don't know, is that sort of thick muscle in the middle of your quads which kind of pops out if it's well developed. The vastus lateralis is the muscle on the side of the leg, and if I've not pronounced that properly, I don't care. And they were measuring the muscle thickness. They also measured the estimated 1 rep max, and they measured peak and average isokinetic knee extension torque at 60 degrees. So essentially the muscle size and the strength. Muscle size is basically mostly what we're interested in, but there was some interesting stuff either way. So one would expect you to get more growth from the rec fem because that is a prime mover in the leg extension. Vastus lateralis isn't so much. That's more of a mover in like squatting exercises, leg presses. But the rec fem is heavily involved in the leg extension. It's actually one of the reasons why you should include some sort of leg extension in your training rather than just rely on squats and leg presses. Okay, now just briefly go over results first of all, and then we'll deep dive further into the method. So the drop set protocol showed statistically greater increases in the rec fem at 30% and 50% of the muscle length. So essentially they measured at different points along the muscle, at 30, 50, and 70. So let's pretend the rec fem starts at the hip. They measured at 30%, then 50, then 70 as you reach the end of the muscle. Now they found that there were statistically greater increases at 30% and 50%. And particularly at 30%, it was bloody significant, where I'm talking 3 times as much. And I'll show you the table of results at the end, but it was not just some small amount. Like, it was massively different in the drop set protocol than it was in the traditional training protocol. Now, there wasn't any change at the 70% muscle length, and also there was no additional size gain in the vastus lateralis. So what does that actually mean? So if we're getting growth in the rec fem, but we're not getting growth in the vastus lateralis, it's actually quite a clever way of looking at things, because it means that we can be relatively certain those students who are kinesiology students, the participants, were probably not doing any other training outside of the study, because that would ruin things, right? Like if they were doing the study, then they were doing a bunch of squats and leg presses and doing leg days on the side. That would ruin the study. But we can be fairly safe that that wasn't occurring, because they didn't get any growth in the vastus lateralis. So they just got growth in the rec fem. And as we said at the beginning, the rec fem is what's mostly targeted with leg extension. So I find that aspect of it really clever, the fact that they targeted just the measuring the rec fem and the vastus lateralis, and we got significantly more growth in rec fem. Really interesting. Now, the other interesting thing is the drop set protocol and the traditional training protocol increased the 1 rep max by about the same. There was no significant increase by either sort of drop set or traditional training protocol on the strength. And this is a common theme we're starting to see, because we saw this in the James Fisher study as well. There was equal increases in strength, but significantly greater increase in size when it came to the drop set protocol. That's crazy, right? You know, we talk all the time about how can guys be really strong and not look the part, right? Well, I mean, this is showing at least one possible mechanism behind why you might be, or you might think to yourself, I've gained lots of size, I've gained lots of strength, but I've not gained the right amount of size. Consumer it to that. Now this is what we're seeing here. So I found that really interesting. So just kind of summarize this. Greater gains with the drop set protocol in the areas we expect to see it, but similar strength increases on both protocols. Interesting stuff. All right, next, I dug into the method a bit more. So basically, yeah, as I said earlier, either leg had either the drop set or the traditional training protocol assigned to it. So for some guys, it was drop set on the left leg and traditional on the right leg. For other guys, it was the opposite, right? Now, the drop set protocol was this. They went to a 5 rep max to momentary muscle failure. So the 5 reps to failure. And then on top of that, they did a 20% drop and they immediately went into the next set. So immediately, there was no rest on these drop sets. And then they immediately went into a 10 to 15% drop and went into the third set. So 1, 2, 3 sets. We're counting that as 3 sets. First set to 5 rep max and to failure, then 20% drop to failure, then 10 to 15% drop to failure. We're counting that as 3 sets. And it averaged out, I think, at close to like a 10 reps total. Now, with the traditional training group, they used their 15 rep max and they went to failure 3 times. So it was around about 13 to 17. So the first set might have been about 15 to 16 to 17, then dropped a bit as they tired, and then dropped a bit more as they tired. But the rest in between those sets was normal, standard, like, you know. So 2 differences there that we do see, though, is that the drop set protocol trained heavier. That's interesting. Okay, because they were using a 5 rep max while the traditional training was using a 15 rep max. Now, we know from the research, well, we can, with the research so far, seems to suggest that that's not a factor. I mean, I'll leave that for you guys to discuss amongst yourselves in the comments. Do we think that's a factor or not? I'm not sure whether the 5 rep max or the 15 rep max was a factor, considering we know that hypertrophy can occur from the 5 rep max right up to the 15 reps, even up to the 30 rep max. So that's something I'll leave for you guys to discuss to see whether it's significant or relevant or not. Now, in terms of the volume, this is also really interesting. So they used an escalating volume setup, right? So first week, it was 3 sets per week. So the drop set protocol was literally just 1 drop set. The traditional training was 3 sets. By the 7th week, they'd slowly increased to 15 sets per week. So the drop set protocol was like, was that 5 drop sets? So 3, you know. And then the traditional training was 15 regular sets. So pretty brutal, but I guess fairly representative of what most people would do. Most people, I guess, would do something in the 10 to 15 range. And if you're using an escalating volume, like an Israel style of volume increase, then you probably would go to about 15 or maybe more. So that was what they did. And so far, I think a very sensible way of doing it. They equated each set, each drop to a regular set, which I think is probably pretty sensible, particularly for something like a leg extension. Like if you did that for a squat, you can't really equate it because your cardiovascular system would give out first. But for a leg extension, it's all right. And I also think it's quite clever they use the 5 rep max, because if you did a 15 rep max on the leg extension followed by a drop set and a drop set, there would be so much lactic acid, you'd give up from the pain. So I actually think a 5 rep max on that is probably quite sensible again. So again, very, very sensible design. Now, these were the results. Now, I'm going to ignore the first 3 columns because they mostly deal with strength and power sort of increases. So let's look at here, the one where it starts RF30 down to where it says VL70. What that means is that's the rec fem at 30% of the length, then rec fem at 50% of the length, then at 70% of the length, and the vastus lateralis at 30, 50, and 70. The common column that we are interested in is the one at the end, which says change, the percentage of change. So check this out. This is the most significant thing. The rec fem at 30% muscle length in the drop set protocol changed by 17%. Now that's a buttload of growth. 17% is bloody significant. But before you think, well, it's just rigged, the traditional training only increased by 3%, which is, you know, still good, but holy crap, like that is massively significant. That's 5 times as much, pretty or more than that. Rec fem at 50% growth increased by 8.3%, and the traditional training by 3.6. So the rec fem with drop set protocol by 8.3%, and traditional training 3.6. The rec fem at 70% was pretty much the same. In fact, the traditional training slightly outshone that, but it wasn't really statistically significant. So I'm finding that pretty interesting. With the vastus lateralis, it was all mostly the same. There was some sort of increases, some greater increases at 30% of the length for the drop set group. For the traditional group, they were slightly better at 50%. For the 70% group, it was about the same. So, yeah, interesting stuff. Essentially, the biggest sort of numbers that we can see in terms of difference are the rec fem at 30 and 50. The vastus lateralis differences, where the drop set protocol is slightly higher and then the traditional training is slightly higher, I think they're not that massively significant because they're a difference of only a small amount of percent. So I wouldn't think too much into that. But the big one that stands out is leg extension, which targets the rec fem, seems to have gotten considerably greater results in hypertrophy, and they have virtually the same results in strength increase. So you can see here at the top right, strength increases within 1 or 2% of each other. So yeah, really interesting. Now, what are the discussion points for this? This is kind of what I want to bring to you guys, and I want to give you my thoughts on it as well. You could go down 2 avenues here. The first avenue is that extending sets is good. You get more relative intensity, like you work harder. You get somewhat of an inclusion effect. You get more disruption. Potentially you're handling heavier loads because you go to a 5 rep max and then extend it. You know, it's basically, you know, DC training, isn't it? Dog crap training. So we could argue the first significant point is that it was the extension of the sets that caused the greater growth. So they took a set to failure and then it just went on and further, and it just went further into failure. And, you know, really, what are you getting with a drop set? You're continuing the rep. So it's kind of like doing a forced rep or doing a cheat rep, you know, or doing a agonistic superset. You know, you're still keeping the stress on the muscle, but you are allowing for a break in intensity to allow you to get more reps, and then a further break to allow you to get more reps. It's a very brutal way of training. It is the classic, you know, Dorian Yates style training. Second point is, maybe it's not the extension of the sets. Maybe it's the fact that they were just training harder. You know, like if you've got a drop set and a further drop set, and you've got, you know, you've got 3 failure points, you're probably going to kill the muscle off pretty well by those end of those 3 sets. So my discussion points on this is my contribution to this is, I think it's probably a case of a combination of both. I think extending sets is good, and I do a lot of drop sets right now, as you guys saw in my training video that I did a week or so ago. I do a hell of a lot of drop sets, and I do them kind of like that. I'll do a very brief rest period of about 30 seconds and then go again, 30 seconds and go again. I don't do it immediate like these guys did, but I'm not sure how relevant that is. But yeah, and I think also training to failure is generally better. So you think about it, right? You've got guys out there who are currently not, or taking 3 minutes rest between sets, who are purposely not going to failure, who are getting stronger. Now, what this study is suggesting, alongside the other study, which I've talked about a lot, and I will do another video on that, is called a comparison of low volume, high intensity training and high volume training, blah, 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 with Fisher and Steele, was that training to failure is actually what gives you greater gains, regardless of the volume used. Training not to failure with more volume appears to give greater strength increases. We are starting to see a picture forming where that might be true, which I find super interesting. And it adds a whole lot of nuance to looking at some of these studies which look at sets across and escalating volumes. because escalating volumes can give you greater strength increase through neural factors, and in a short-term study it can have greater inflammation, which can give the impression of growth, if you measure it. But these guys, they measured with an ultrasound, so it was very accurate. An ultrasound is a lot better than just wrapping a tape around your muscle, which can take into account inflammation. And I also find it interesting that this study came from Schoenfeld, and the previous study, which showed exactly the same thing, came from Fisher and Steele, and because those guys are, known for their heavy training to failure with low volume. We're starting to see a fairly certain case here, guys, for brutally hard training being what you should go for. And all these guys saying you don't need to train to failure is, yeah, it's starting to look less likely. Like, you may just have to bust your ass. All right. Personally, I think this kind of stuff is fantastically interesting. Hope you guys do too. Let me know what you think. What are the take homes for this for you? Like, do you think it's the extending sets? Do you think it's just busting ass? Do you think it's a combination of two? Do you think it was relevant that the leg extension group used a 5 rep max, the drop set group, sorry, used a 5 rep max, and the regular training used a 15 rep max? Or is that just close enough to not matter because they were both trained to failure? What do you guys think? And yeah, I will talk to you next time, but I find this very interesting.